that we've become all too familiar with over the course of the last couple of years. Now, whilst the jury may still be out, it is becoming increasingly clear that following the science may indeed not have been the best advice after all. My guest tonight has experienced this firsthand previously within her own life in her battle to find a solution for her son's autism. And during the course of the pandemic, quickly found many parallels to the dizzying madness of the changing restrictions and rules throughout the response to COVID-19. Our guest tonight, Ann Bauer, is a published author. She's written 3 novels as well as a memoir and cookbook co-authored with the Hell's Kitchen founder, Chef Mitch Omer. Her writing has appeared in Elle, Salon, Slate, The Sun, The Washington Post, The New York Times, and she's been honored by Harvard's Nieman Foundation for Excellence in Nonfiction Writing. But to our audience, Ann is likely to be best known for her article in The Tablet, written in 2021, entitled I Have Been Through This Before, which explores our deference to authority and experts in times of need through her own experience of dealing with autism of her late son, Andrew, and the parallels that were witnessed throughout the pandemic, as Follow the Science became the unchallenged mantra of the media and indeed the masses. In this episode, Ann is going to recount some of her own story and draw these parallels. And we're going to unpack why we place so much trust in the hands of the experts and what it could mean and what the consequences could be if we continue to do so. So, Ann, first and foremost, a huge welcome to the Elevate podcast. It's great to have you with us here today.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
So, Ann, I first came across your incredible article, really recounting your story of your challenges in trying to find a solution to the challenges posed by autism for your late son, Andrew. And I read with fascination, actually, as hard as it was to read the challenges that you've been through and the sad end to the story, that we see so many parallels with this deference to authority and this idea that we need to trust the experts. Could you paint the picture for us? Could you tell us a little bit about the story of the challenges you went through in the context of experiencing this notion that we should follow the science and trust in the experts?
Certainly. My son was born in 1988. I had just turned 21. So I was a very untested, inexperienced mom. He started showing signs of what they would later call autism, but it was never quite clear, when he was nearly 4. So he was late to show signs of this. He had developed normally. Suddenly he was, holding a hand in front of his face. He was spinning wheels of a car. He lost language for a short time. And my husband and I, also a very young guy, went out and sought the help of experts because that's what you do. We went to the Early Childhood Center in Duluth, Minnesota, which is where we were living at the time. And this was maybe 1991. They didn't call it autism immediately. They called it developmental delay. They called it PDD. They called it early childhood schizophrenia at one point. But the one thing that we caught, that kind of tail end of, was the Bruno Bettelheim era, which was parents are to blame for this. So a child psychiatrist, a charlatan, a man who made up his credentials and achieved a post at the University of Chicago in the 50s, had come up with a theory that cold, evil mothers caused psychosis and autism in children. This theory was the prevailing, it was what was taught in psychiatric institutions for years, for decades. We were living on the Iron Range in Minnesota, which is a place where they're maybe 8-10 years behind on, what the trends in science are. They were still practicing this. And so the very first thing that my young husband and I heard was, you're not prepared to be parents. You are not raising this child appropriately. We might have to take him away from you. So that was how we began.
Goodness me.
Uh, at one point, they talked about taking our younger son as well. We had a child who was 2 years younger than Andrew. Um, and we convinced them not to take our sons if we would attend parenting classes and sort of be guided by the experts in how to raise these children. And that's how we began.
Mm.
As time went on, we moved to Minneapolis, to an urban center where we felt like there would be more resources and more, up-to-date science to help us address our son's condition. We came down here to the Twin Cities in 1993, and we were very quickly told, "Your son has autism." "Oh, that thing they told you before, yeah, we don't believe that anymore. It isn't that mothers cause it." And then there was a whole new explanation. "This is a sensory disorder. Here's what you need to do." They issued us scrubbing brushes that we were to rough up his skin with in order to realign his sensory nerves. We had to take these surgical brushes and rub his skin every day 3 times. They had us doing certain exercises. They had him going to programs where he was using a rocking board. He would sit and he would rock on the board. Excuse me. And this was to help him sort of integrate his internal need to rock with society's expectations. He was issued chewing gum. There was a whole new battery of things.
Mm.
As we went through his childhood, I would say once a year, the science would change. It went from the rocking board to a program called LOVOS, which is best known today as conversion therapy. It's what's used to try to sort of train the gay out of people.
Mm.
It was a Skinnerian behavioral therapy where you were supposed to use incentives and, ever so slightly punitive consequences in order to exhort the right behavior. Then there was floor time. There was enter your child's sphere. You had to hire people to work with him 24 hours a day and sit on the floor with him and enter his world. And so every time we turned around, someone was saying, "Oh, the reason your child isn't better is because you're not doing this." "Oh, wait, you're still feeding him wheat? That's the problem. He's gluten intolerant. Here, he must have candida." At one point, he was put on a therapy for people with florid overgrowth of bacteria, of candidiasis. We went through one kind of whipsaw trend after another. And the problem is when you are desperate to help a child who is suffering and who is not developing, you grab onto the next thing and you think, "Oh, okay, maybe they figured it out now. Here, we'll do this." By the time Andrew was in high school, and we had been through all of these therapies, and some of them worked a little, and some of them worked not at all, and other things that we tried on our own actually had an effect. The entire psychiatric community changed again, and their recommendation was pharmaceuticals. It was all pharmaceuticals all the time. Pharmaceuticals for OCD, and then you spike it with an antipsychotic because you need that little lift. And then you add maybe a little bit of lithium because who knows if there's some bipolar in there. And there was this constant, taking of our son and a little bit of this drug and a little bit of that drug. And I was watching him deteriorate as this was happening. At one point said, "I don't believe in this. We have to stop," and was told that the state would take and commit my son if I did not agree to keep medicating him because it would be tantamount to abuse.
My goodness. My goodness. This is a shocking story to hear, Anne, and thank you for openly sharing the difficulties you went through. And of course, we're talking about a condition here now that is, as you've outlined, has been examined and looked at for many years. Whereas in the parallel, looking at COVID-19, this is something that is a novel virus, and yet we're still told that the science is settled and we should follow the expertise. And lo and behold, we also have this deference to authority and expertise, told that we have to, that we have to follow these particular protocols, many of which have been untested, and also a reliance on pharmaceuticals, which I'm shocked. Well, I say I'm shocked. I'm not. I'm no longer surprised at all to hear about any medical condition that is now where the treatment is reliant upon pharmaceuticals. So, having been through what you went through, Anne, and I think it may be worth us underscoring that as hard as it may be, how the story ended, so that people can understand where it led. Before we go on to exploring the parallels, would you share what happened to Andrew? Obviously referenced in the introduction that he's no longer with us.
What happened? We don't know. My son was found dead in his assisted living apartment. It was a state kind of partnership with a nonprofit, an organization that had set up living arrangements for adults with autism. So he was supposedly under the care of people who knew how to help him. We'd had many concerns about what was going on in this facility, and in fact had been in the process of moving him to a different situation. We got a call one November morning that his staff walked into his apartment and found him on the floor, unconscious, empty coffee cup beside him. So he'd gotten up, he'd made coffee, he'd drunk the coffee, and that he apparently stood up and had a sudden death event. There were a lot of investigations. The police handled this because when a 28-year-old dies with no apparent cause, there's a reason to investigate. The police found nothing except that many items in his apartment were gone. Could not tell if he had given them away or they'd been taken. An autopsy was performed. I got a call at one point from our local coroner's office, and they said, listen, we called in some people from elsewhere to help us with this because we cannot find a cause of death. And we don't like to tell parents, there is no reason that your 28-year-old son is dead. They could speculate that it could have been a sudden arrhythmia or seizure, but there was no clear signs of either. He just left. And my personal feeling, and I'm going to betray my own worldview here, is that he was tired of it. I think he was tired of being held captive by the constant controls and changes in therapies. He was unable to live with us for many reasons. One of them was that he had had one episode of violence in his early 20s, probably due to a medication that he was on. He had been under state control on and off throughout his 20s, and so we were sort of not permitted to take him off the medications. There was a lot of oversight. It was a situation that was so confusing and complicated that by the time we got to where he was when he died, none of us knew the way forward or the way out. And I really believe that he sort of decided one day, I need to leave. This is this is not a world for me.
I'm so sorry to hear that, Anne. It's a desperately tragic story, and I can't imagine how much you and Andrew himself went through so many twists and turns. What what was the parallel for you when over the last couple of years did you stop and feel that you'd been through this before? When was the alarm raised for you?
Oh, um, so when March 11th, 2020, I had not written for publication for many years. I had stepped back. I was living, to me, sort of a quiet life that was the after, you know. It was after Andrew died. I didn't have any ambition at all. I still don't. And so you kind of have to have some grand reason to want to be out there, and I didn't have it. However, when March came and Fauci was on television talking about this virus and how we would need to stop seeing one another and shut down basic infrastructure like schools and transportation and libraries and social services. And our own governor here in Minnesota took a very hard line. We were shut down almost immediately. There were there were hotlines set up for neighbors to report on one another if they, saw two people going into a neighbor's home or saw their neighbors leave when they should have been inside. There was this automatic on the part of everyone I knew, except my husband, assumption that the experts were doing the right thing and that we should follow. And it didn't happen for me. I just didn't feel that way. It looked like a catastrophe unfolding. And so I began saying things like, "Oh, we're shutting the schools. What's going to happen to the children who get their meals there? What's going to happen to the children like mine who get their services there? What's going to happen to the children who are so low income that these are the eyes on them? This is where they get their resources. This is where we have mandatory reporters. We can't do this to children." And the response from my community was such extraordinary blowback and anger. I lost half of my friends and business contacts immediately. And that really felt like an alert that something was wrong. How could even raising these questions be so wrong? So I began seeking out, was there anyone else out there who was feeling this way? My husband and I were sitting here alone in our home in a very, very, very liberal, Democrat controlled area. We were lifelong Democrats. And zero of our friends and our colleagues and our family members felt the same way. And we thought, okay, either we're totally nuts or there's something crazy going on here. And I actually activated a Twitter account that I hadn't used in years. And I went on and I looked to see, is anyone else saying these things? And I found this little pocket of people. Among them were the people from Tablet. A magazine that I had loved and read as a literary Jewish, kind of part of my culture. But I was seeing these people who I had long respected and loved their writing hint at these same things I was feeling and thinking, oh, okay. So we're entirely alone here in St. Paul, Minnesota, but we're not entirely alone. And over time, as I read what Tablet was publishing, I finally thought, okay, there's a reason to step forward and say something. There's a
Yeah.
reason to say, this is reminding me of that kind of zealous, religious whipsaw of treatments that I experienced and my son did. And it's happening again.
Yes. No. Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, that article is pertinent. When I read that, I was absolutely certain that I wanted to speak with you because, well, firstly, I shared so many similarities in my own
Mm.
experience when I first started simply asking questions about the protocols that the governments were following. I remember, I think it was in March 2020, I posted 5 questions onto social media and I got abuse for asking questions. They were not loaded questions, they were simply asking questions. And I didn't have the courage to even keep the post up at the time. And things changed radically as I launched the podcast and spent 2 years asking big questions. But
Yes.
uh, but like yourself, I reached a point where I couldn't just watch any longer. I had to find a way to speak into what was happening, and little by little, I found other people were willing to ask the questions, and they included eminent scientists. Some of the first people I came face to face with were the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration, which we know was publicly smeared as a result of a deliberate smear campaign put forth by Dr. Fauci. But these are respected doctors that have come from Oxford, Harvard, Stanford, some of the most respected universities, academic institutions on earth, yet they're being disparaged as fringe, which is quite ludicrous. So I certainly experienced that challenge, but obviously not with the same lens as you have been through in terms of witnessing this, the risks of, I suppose, having that deference to authority and trust in experts with an unquestioning mind. And of course, it's
Even with a questioning mind,
even
it it didn't seem to help. Even when we questioned, if you are the vulnerable people, you get rolled over.
yes, no, I agree. So, what do you think we can observe about this deference to authority under the context of your own story, the pandemic? We've kind of been ingrained that we trust the experts, and this became prolific during the pandemic. What lessons do you think we can learn from this? Is this a habitual pattern? What are your observations?
Yes, this is a habitual pattern. I'm sorry, I'm not going to be optimistic on we're going to change our stripes front. This is a habitual pattern that is, I think, as old as humanity. People want simple answers. And the great thing about these so-called expert edicts is that they give you simple black and white answers. They say, oh, the child is autistic, the mother is to blame, or the vaccine is to blame, or, oh, you're feeding them wheat, that's the problem. There is a human need to have that sort of, it's one or the other, and this person's to blame. Oh, now I can go forward. The thing that we were given in the pandemic was, here's the group of people that is to blame. It kept switching, but that didn't seem to bother anyone. It was spring breakers, it was Republicans, it was people who got their hair cut, it was, people who didn't want to wear a mask, it was the unvaccinated, it was whoever it was, there was a group to blame. And that somehow is enough. That is the framework, and as far as a lot of people want to go. When there is a crisis, when there is something inexplicable or scary or dangerous. I think this has happened throughout history in every single way that it can, and it will continue to happen.
I think there's two very important pieces there. You referenced the oversimplification of the situation and the blame culture that comes with the
Mhm.
the risk. The idea that this is a respiratory virus that's passed from human to human. It was simplified to that level. There was no reference to underlying risk factors, the health of the individual, the a whole range of
You
other
get kicked off
variables.
social media for talking about underlying risk factors.
Oh, absolutely get censored, deplatformed, but there was no. Similarly, there was no wider analysis of the harms of policy, the risks of, as you talked about, taking children out of school. I mean, and as I mentioned in the introduction, a lot of this now, the science has once again changed, and it's recognizing the harms that were caused, despite the public a portion of public outcry from within certain circles who were asking questions. So we've witnessed the harms now that's caused, and we're looking back at this. And of course, the risk is we now enter into the same patterns of oversimplification and blame, just in reverse. Do you think this type of scenario is more prevalent or probable under conditions of high stress, fear, anxiety, where do you think that puts pressure on our ability to think critically under these different circumstances?
Fear. I
Fear.
think I think there are two drivers at work here. One is fear, and the other is control. The fear of the masses, the control of the few. And there has been, throughout all of history, when we look at the ways that people can be manipulated, the way that it is the most effective tool an aspiring leader, dictator has, is fear. Because people will do things that go against their own values when they are afraid. And I think that's what we just watched. If you make someone afraid at a certain base kind of reptilian level, about 80% of the population, from my calculation, will do whatever you say to make themselves feel more secure.
Mm.
And I think it's just a really easy lever to pull. So even if some of the so-called experts started out trying to do what they thought was best, which I think in some cases may have been possible, there was zero chance that they would then swerve from their original position, because that would be politically disadvantageous for them. So, even if they started out trying to do the right thing, they very quickly fell into using the fear in order to keep themselves in exactly the same position of authority. And it is so powerful, and it seems to work no matter what.
I mean, that stood out for me when I read your article about Bruno Bettelheim and how he was able to continue to do what he did. And it feels like there's almost a doubling down of the process or protocols that they follow, and they'll look for any shred of evidence to support their ideas, and they essentially become left unchallenged in many ways. What do you think we need to do to generate greater scrutiny? Do you think it's possible that we can find a way forward where public scrutiny of this area? Have you witnessed anything in the fields of autism through the course of your journey where you saw a ray of light or a ray of hope that there was going to be a more holistic way of examining the situation that comes with questions and critical thinking?
No, I have not. I think there's a new sort of dilemma in the autistic community, and that is that today the people who are sort of managing the science are talking about neurodiversity and how this is a perfectly normal and welcome development and you should embrace it, which leaves all of the parents of profoundly cognitively disabled, not toilet trained, shrieking children out of the conversation. So it's just sort of a different, oh, if you can't embrace your child's absolute suffering, and then you again are the problem. So we just keep going around the wheel. And when something is not controllable or explainable, I think we will keep running into these unhealthy binary theories that divide people against one another. And it's been happening with autism, I think, since autism began.
Mm.
I believe that there is greater scrutiny of the specifics of the pandemic today. You know, I think trust in the CDC has probably plummeted. I think that there are more people who are now saying, oh, well, maybe we were fooled about that. But I don't necessarily think that translates to the next thing.
Mm.
And I don't know what brings you to greater scrutiny on the next thing.
Yes, I mean your point around this being a age-old problem, I think many would observe. I think it's become visceral within the last couple of years, where we've all lived through an experience that's a global experience, meaning that most of us have now had a face-to-face experience of this, whether people are conscious of it or not. But I do wonder what factors create the conditions for which people, and I know the world of psychology has addressed this. We've had guests on the show talk about some of these things and the role of the human mind. But do you think there are factors? Are we increasingly over domesticated, that we no longer trust our instincts? Do you think there's factors in the education system, the media? Is this more broadly systemic?
I think at this point, the factors that I see are cultural. And so everything I know about situations like this, I found in literature. That's what I do, I read. And so this seems to me very much like the emergency in India, and how Indira Gandhi was able to seize absolute power for a period of about 19 months because of class divisions, because of that sort of tribalism of the caste system, because of people's willingness to look down on and tolerate the suffering of the other. And I think that what we have here in the US, and I don't know where you are in the UK, but there are certainly parallels there. We have an incredibly divided society. We have people who are willing to behave in ways that are admittedly uncivil. We have a former president calling for censorship. A guy I voted for twice, by the way. I'm really reeling. I mean, we have forces at work that are making the situation worse, not better. And I think that as long as people are divided, as long as there is permission to hate, revile, wish death upon one's other, as long as it is perfectly acceptable to have, you know, billionaires and streets lined with tents, as long as all of these things are going on, that binary thinking will be more and more and more appealing. Because if you are constantly rationalizing things that don't make sense, we will make democracy great by censoring people. This is a message I heard from both Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. Again, two people that I have voted for. We're going to make democracy better by censoring people. If you can compute that in your mind, then you're not thinking critically. You know, if you can believe we're going to shut down the schools for a year and a half, but the children will be fine. It is this ability to believe things that are logically so inconsistent and unbelievable that you have to be able to make that leap. And I don't see that going away.
Yes, I would say it's worsening. The censorship is worsening,
Yes.
and it's not limited to the pandemic. It's much broader. And you're absolutely right. In order to operate within a democratic society, one must. Free speech is one of the fundamental tenets, because how do you assess, even within the context of the right to vote, how do you make decisions if you don't have full information, or at least access to the possibility of full information? So I think this is a worrying trend. I agree with you. Do you see? I also recognise and I believe this has worsened in recent history. The polarization, particularly through social media, the algorithm, it plays a role in creating this tribalism. Do you see a path ahead in terms of uniting people? Do you see any? Is there a spiritual path? Is there what do you believe could actually break humanity through these patterns? What could break these patterns, rather?
Oh, wow. That is such a good question. And I feel terribly unqualified. um, I'm going to give you a pat answer to start because that's always my answer. And the answer is story. People respond to story. People responded to my story. Even people who hated my position on the pandemic responded favorably to my story. So that was an interesting thing. I think it's possible. And this is me talking way above my head. I have no qualifications to say this, so let's just give me a pass. But it's possible that commerce may drag us out of this. And I think that's so weird, but I love a good twist in a story. The fact that commercial economic factors are sort of leveling things, that we're seeing, and I know everyone's picking on them today, so it's low-hanging fruit, but I'm going to go there. The CNN Plus that just tanked out of the box, and they went too far, the constant stream of bias didn't need a second paid platform, apparently. And I would say the same thing about Fox. I don't have any cable for exactly that reason. But I think we're finally seeing the market sort of correct some of these things. Netflix is going down, Tesla is going up. What is that telling us? The airlines are saying, no more mask mandates. We have journalists saying, 56% of people want them. If 56% of people wanted mask mandates, the airlines would want them. We finally have that sort of capitalistic consequence that is the measure, that is the blind study result. And so it is possible, and I say this as someone who couldn't care less about economics or capitalism in a clinical, studious sense, it is possible that system of free market may actually show us a way forward. That literature, always literature, always, 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 I do have one more thing to say if there's time.
Yes, please. Yeah.
I'm reading a book. It's called Pull of the Stars. It was written by a woman from Ireland, Emma Donoghue, who has written many wonderful books. It's about the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. And the interesting thing about this book is she began writing it on the anniversary, on the 100 years. So it was 2018 when she wrote this book. I believe she finished it in 19, and they sped it through the system and got it out there because, we have a pandemic of our own. So let's, seize on the PR potential of this. I'm reading the book, and I had heard over and over that the book would underscore the need for everything that we're doing in the COVID pandemic. In fact, it's just the opposite.
Wow.
In this book that she wrote a year and a half before the pandemic, before our pandemic, her heroine is a brave Sinn Féin associated suffragette doctor who says masks are bullshit. The government wants you to think they work. They really don't. This is in the book that she wrote right before this pandemic. All of the posters about don't assemble, don't get together, don't, socialization is murder. And again, in this hospital, they're talking about how this is ridiculous and this is the government, the corrupt government trying to exert its control. So all of the same things are happening in here.
Mm.
But the funny thing is, and I'm a member of this community, so I can tell you for sure, Ms. Donahue would not be allowed to say those things out loud in the literary community. So all of her interviews that I have read sort of act like this book is in favor of all the things that we're doing today. And you have to actually read the whole thing to realize, oh, they learned that exactly the same lessons back then. And yet even the author won't say it, won't come
Yes.
out and say, I did all the research. In fact, masks did not work in 1918.
Yes. Yes. I mean, this is again, it's a function of what we've talked about free speech or council culture. I mean, it's self-censorship to a degree, but this is now also happening. We're witnessing not only technological censorship, but the Overton window is shrinking. People are speaking in much more regulated forms in order not to upset the apple cart or be judged or fear reprimand. On one hand, you can understand. I've experienced a fair share of verbal abuse, and it's not nice. I think we need to improve our humanity and get back to human values and have shared reverence for one another despite our differences, because let's be real, there's very little that all of humanity is going to agree upon. So let's live through that with a smile and with love, because otherwise we're just going to spend the rest of our lifetime falling out over the next big thing, which is already happening. So I share that sentiment that there is this risk, and it is a trajectory that we're on, and your market observation is interesting, because actually historically, I've looked at this myself, politically, economically, culturally, socially, when things like this happen, there tends to be an adjustment, and I believe that adjustment is happening on multiple fronts. Already there's kind of new communities emerging, sense-making communities, who recognize the piece that you spoke about earlier about this oversimplification. And there's whole communities now arising looking at how do we make sense of the complexity of life? How do we make sense of the complexity of situations like a pandemic or any other crisis, any cultural crisis we're facing, and actually zooming out and looking at the interrelationships amongst things, which is something that we just was distinctly lacking over the last 2 years. We had this singular myopic focus around cases, hospitalizations, and deaths. No other consequence mattered. You could obliterate the earth as long as we got cases down. It didn't matter. But there's now a whole new wave of really smart people who may not have paid attention during the pandemic. A lot of them have, but looking now at how do we make sense of the world. I just know that that's part of the shift, because now people are asking what leads to these centralized control systems, the things that we have lived with for hundreds of years. Why is that happening? How do certain entities have such influence over the way our lives are governed? How do we start to shift those balances? And I think we're starting to see through the markets, politics, social. It may take time, but I think there is that shift in response. I'd be very curious. You mentioned that you voted Democrat. You're traditionally a Democrat. I was shocked at the kind of liberal Democrat position, because there was so much harm being caused through education, the huge widening of inequalities, and harm caused to children, harm caused to the healthcare system. And to my mind, these are all things that are dear to the traditional Democrat or liberal values. And I wonder where the adjustments will be politically now, because it feels like the left and the right have flipped upside down, and there is no.
It does. Believe me.
What's your perception of where things will go politically?
I think the left is dug in. I am someone who I certainly had started to have some misgivings. I would say the Russia collusion story is probably where I go back to being that person who was saying, wait a minute, is it possible that these people who I have been really holding as the good guys, oh, this is not making sense. So it was slightly before the pandemic. The behavior and the policies of my former party during this have been execrable. I cannot support, could not vote for someone in the DNC affiliated Democratic Party right now or for the foreseeable future.
Mm, mm.
I'm not completely comfortable with my options.
No.
I'm very socially liberal. I'm constantly sort of in that middle space of, I am uncomfortable with some of the LGBT stances of the right, many of them, in fact. I'm certainly not wholesale off to the other side, but I simply cannot ever vote for someone like our governor or our current president, who has done, I think, just a sinful amount of damage for the sake of power.
Mm. That is a quote right there. I think we've seen that throughout the pandemic, and it's not limited to your president. How money and power has corrupted. I think the depths of that have been witnessed, and I think also on this thread of the kind of liberal side, the democratic side, my frustration has been that, again, traditionally the left side of politics is standing up against that corruption that comes with the money and power of the central authorities. Yet that is just
Apparently not.
disappeared. But even in that, again, I think I'm seeing ripple effects. I'm seeing bubbles of people going, hang on a minute. This feels very similar to what we've campaigned upon in hundreds of other areas. So I think there's hope. I suppose I'd like to close by asking, you started writing again through this article. What story would you tell off the back of this? If there was something that you would write into the future to almost to offer a precautionary tale to humanity, what story would you write off the back of everything you've gone through over the last couple of years?
So I was completely surprised by the response to this piece. I thought it would go out in Tablet Magazine, maybe 1,000 people would read it, I might get a nice note or two. The response has been extraordinary. I have hundreds of letters, and I have talked to a number of people, and there are a few who are asking me to expand on this story in particular. And I think the question is whether or not I will do that. I'm not sure. I have to see that it would do some good, I have to, and really it has. This essay helped me reunite with some people who just frankly thought I was a lunatic, who thought I was an anti-patriotic, I was called everything you can imagine, Trumpy, crazy, grammar killer, lunatic. And this essay helped me sort of introduce, well, actually, this is the way that I'm thinking of it. And so I think if it can continue to have that ameliorating effect, I would go forward and tell this story in book or film or whatever format.
Yes. I will ask one more question on that vein then. This podcast is entitled the Elevate Podcast. Really, it's our mission is to elevate humanity and enrich the world and make a positive difference to mankind. It's not often that I get to speak to authors. If there was a story that we need to author collectively for humanity that would elevate beyond what we've just experienced in the last couple of years, what story would we need to tell as a species to go beyond this?
Oh, that is such a good question. I think there are people who are starting to do this. I think some of the stories are about race, but they're not the stories people think. They're not the stories about how different we are. They're the stories about how alike we are. I think those stories that make so many of those lines irrelevant, we have a yearning for those. And I think when I look at the books that have had the most impact for me, Angle of Repose, which if we were sitting together, would be handing you a copy because I think everyone should read this. A Fine Balance, the books that are about the way society cracks and comes back together. They always have flawed, real characters. We don't have flawed, real characters. We have characters who we think of as either the science or the devil. We need to get to that story of real people and how fallible and yet human and dignified they are. And I think we have not gotten that out of this pandemic. I have not yet seen a single TV show or film or book that has treated this with even close to the kind of complexity and nuance that we need. I don't know who's going to be the first to do it, but they'll have my undying respect. I believe that we need a story that shows how impossible this was and how incredibly not black and white. How it's just a situation that is. It is not, it is not something that you can apportion blame for. So I expect that to come. I expect it to come journalistically, possibly, maybe, from Matt Taibbi or Barry Weiss. Someday, sometime soon. There's a woman named Trish Wood in Canada, whom I adore, who is telling a lot of these stories with a kind of wry, sardonic, I'm a broad who's been there kind of. I love her kind of attitude. I think we're starting there with the oral storytelling. And then the voices are cropping up. One of the most interesting things to me is David Mamet. He arose out of nowhere, this absolutely extraordinary playwright, and said, oh, by the way, all of this has been totalitarianism. And you're like, oh my God, he said that. Maybe David Mamet, maybe someone else who is brave enough to write the All Our Sons, the Crucible, the Long Day's Journey, out of this story. And I don't know who that is. I don't know.
Maybe
But I
maybe
think
maybe Ann Bauer. We'll see.
I don't know. Ann Bauer is no David Mamet, I'm sorry to say. But I think that's what we need, is that story that says, this is so big. It is not about you. Here's how small you are in this tale. And you don't know. What you are seeing is like looking at the sky through a straw. There's a whole universe out there, and somehow we need that.
Beautiful. And thank you so much for your having the courage to share your story. First in the tablet, but here today with us on the Elevate podcast, and such an inspiring message of hope to land on. I will listen back to what you've just shared, and I really do feel that story that brings us together and helps us to recognize the complexity of the world and the role that we play in it, I think is so essential right now. And we'll do our best on the Elevate podcast to create a thread that can weave things together and bring people together in united polarity, in our celebrate our differences and bring us together with a shared desire to make the world a better place. Perhaps we can make a difference in our lifetimes. But thank you once again, Anne, and thank you to our audience. This is the Elevate podcast with me, Dan Astin-Gregory. If you're not yet on our mailing list, please join at danastingregory.com/podcast. Be up to date with all the fantastic conversations like this one with Anne today. We're covering a range of subjects, looking at how we can elevate ourselves personally, but also elevate society and learn the lessons of what's gone before us in order to craft a brighter and bolder future. So thank you so much again, Anne, and thank you to our audience. And I look forward to seeing you on the very next episode of the Elevate podcast.
Thank you.